The rich man took the street kid to the lavish event, expecting nothing but laughter. But when a woman recognized Miguel, everyone was shocked. Miguel stood at the busy intersection, a rag in one hand and a spray bottle in the other. The sun beat down on him, making the asphalt shimmer. He squinted through the traffic, looking for a car that might stop, someone who'd give him a few coins. Most people didn't even look at him. He was used to that. They kept their windows rolled up, eyes forward, waiting for the light to change. Sometimes they'd shoo him away or yell at him. Today was no different. A blue sedan rolled to a stop. Miguel approached quickly, giving the windshield a quick spray before the driver could protest. The driver, a middle-aged man with sunglasses, sighed and rolled his window down just enough to push a few coins out. Miguel grabbed them with a nod and moved on, not even bothering to say thanks. It wasn't much, but it was something. He stepped back onto the curb, where his friend Rafa sat, watching. Rafa, a boy just a year or two older than Miguel, was eating a piece of bread he had found earlier. He broke off a piece and handed it to Miguel. "Not bad today, huh?" Rafa said, his mouth full. Miguel took the bread and shrugged. "Could be worse." The two sat there for a moment, sharing the bread, watching the cars pass by. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. Life was about surviving the day, then figuring out the next one when it came. As the afternoon dragged on, Miguel made his way to another intersection. This one was busier, closer to the nicer part of town. He looked up at the buildings, tall and clean, windows reflecting the sunlight. He imagined what it must be like to live up there, away from the noise and the grime. He couldn't picture it clearly, but he knew it had to be different, better. That was when he noticed the black SUV. It was too nice, too clean for this part of the city. It rolled up slowly, and Miguel saw the driver, a man in a sharp suit, sunglasses perched on his nose. The window rolled down, and the man looked at him, a strange smile on his face. "Hey, kid," the man called. "Come here." Miguel hesitated, but he stepped closer. The man looked rich, but there was something in his smile that Miguel didn't like. "Want to make some money?" the man asked. Miguel narrowed his eyes. "Doing what?" The man laughed, a sound that made Miguel's skin crawl. "Nothing too hard. Just come with me to an event tonight. I'll give you new clothes, a hot meal, and some cash. Easy, right?" Miguel frowned. It sounded strange, but the promise of food and money made his stomach twist. He hadn't had a real meal in days, and he could use the cash. He looked back at Rafa, who was now watching from the sidewalk, a concerned look on his face. "What kind of event?" Miguel asked. "Just a fancy party. You'll be my guest," the man said, still smiling. "Name's Otavio, by the way." Miguel glanced at Rafa again, then back at Otavio. He didn't trust this guy, but he also didn't have many choices. He nodded slowly. "All right," Miguel said. "I'll do it." Otavio's smile widened, and he opened the door. "Get in, kid." Miguel climbed into the SUV, his heart pounding. As they drove off, he looked out the window, watching Rafa disappear into the distance. He didn't know what he was getting into, but it was too late to back out now. The SUV moved through the nicer parts of the city, past clean streets and fancy stores. Miguel stared out the window, feeling out of place. Otavio didn't say much, just hummed along to the music playing softly from the speakers. After a while, they pulled up to a clothing store. It was the kind of place Miguel had only seen from the outside, the kind where the clothes looked like they cost more than he'd ever make. Otavio led him inside, and a woman approached them immediately, her eyes scanning Miguel with thinly veiled disapproval. Otavio waved her off, telling her to find something nice but simple. Miguel stood awkwardly, his eyes darting around the store. Everything was bright and clean, and he felt like he didn't belong. The woman came back with a suit. Black, simple, but clearly expensive. Miguel took it and disappeared into the changing room. He struggled with the button, the fabric stiff under his fingers. He looked at himself in the mirror, feeling like a fraud. This wasn't him. This wasn't his life. He was just a kid from the streets, and now he was wearing a suit like he was someone important. Otavio knocked on the door. "You ready, kid? Let's go." Miguel stepped out, and Otavio looked him over, nodding approvingly. "Perfect," he said. "Now, let's get moving. We've got a party to attend." Miguel followed Otavio back to the SUV, his stomach twisting in knots. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He looked down at his new clothes, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. This wasn't his world, but for tonight, He'd have to pretend it was. And with that, they drove off, the city lights growing brighter as they headed toward the unknown. Miguel sat in the back of Otavio's SUV, his fingers nervously tugging at the cuffs of the suit. The fabric felt strange against his skin, stiff and uncomfortable. He looked out the window as they passed through streets lined with luxury stores, fancy restaurants, and people who looked like they belonged in a world he had only ever seen from afar. He swallowed hard, trying to push away the doubts creeping in. Otavio glanced at him through the rearview mirror, a smirk on his face. "Nervous, kid?" he asked, his voice dripping with amusement. Miguel shrugged, trying to seem indifferent. "Not really?" he lied. Otavio chuckled, shaking his head. "Relax, just stick by me, keep your mouth shut, and it'll be over before you know it. Besides, you're getting paid, remember?" Miguel nodded but said nothing. The mention of money reminded him why he was here in the first place. He needed it, more than anything. But the idea of walking into some fancy event, surrounded by people who would look at him and know he didn't belong, it made his stomach twist in knots. They arrived at a grand building, all lit up, with valet attendants waiting by the entrance. Otavio pulled up, and one of the attendants rushed over, opening Miguel's door. Miguel hesitated before stepping out, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The rich, polished crowd, the perfectly dressed men and women, they all turned to look, their eyes narrowing as they noticed him. Otavio came around the car, placing a hand on Miguel's shoulder, guiding him toward the entrance. "Keep your head up, kid," he said, though his voice lacked any real encouragement. It felt more like a challenge. They entered the grand ballroom, and Miguel was immediately overwhelmed. Chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, the light reflecting off the golden accents on the walls. The room was filled with people in expensive suits and dresses, each holding a glass of champagne or laughing in small groups. Miguel could feel their eyes on him, the whispers that followed as he walked by. "Who's that kid?" someone muttered. "Why is Otavio bringing someone like him here?" another whispered. Miguel kept his eyes forward, trying to ignore them. Otavio led him through the crowd, his hand still on Miguel's shoulder. He stopped by a group of men in suits, all of them looking at Miguel with a mix of confusion and amusement. "Gentlemen," Otavio said, his voice loud and confident, "I'd like you to meet Miguel. He's my special guest tonight." The men exchanged glances, then looked at Miguel, their eyes scanning his ill-fitting suit, his nervous stance. One of them raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "A special guest? Huh?" the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Quite an interesting choice, Otavio." Miguel felt his face heat up, his hands clenching at his sides. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. Otavio laughed, clapping Miguel on the back. "Thought I'd show him how the other side lives," Otavio said, his tone mocking. "Give him a taste of the good life, right, kid?" Miguel forced a smile, nodding slightly. He felt small, like he was nothing more than a joke to these people. He glanced around the room, catching the curious and judgmental stares of the guests. He wanted to disappear. Otavio moved on, pulling Miguel along with him, introducing him to more guests, each introduction more humiliating than the last. Every time, Miguel felt the same burning shame, the same desire to just turn around and leave. But he couldn't. He needed the money. At one point, Otavio left him alone for a moment to talk to some of his friends. Miguel stood by the edge of the room, his eyes on the floor, trying to block out the laughter and the whispers around him. He thought about running. The door wasn't far. He could just leave, go back to the streets, where at least he knew what to expect. But then what? He'd still be hungry, still be alone. "Hey," a voice said, pulling him from his thoughts. Miguel looked up to see a woman standing in front of him. She was well-dressed, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant style, her eyes kind. She smiled at him, a real smile, not the mocking smirks he'd been getting all night. "You okay?" she asked. Miguel hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly not believing him. She glanced over at Otavio, who was still talking animatedly with his friends, then back at Miguel. "I'm Clara," she said, extending her hand. "Nice to meet you." Miguel looked at her hand for a moment, then shook it awkwardly. "Miguel," he said. Clara smiled again. "You don't look like you're enjoying yourself very much, Miguel." Miguel let out a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, not really my kind of place." Clara nodded, her eyes softening. "I get that," she said. She glanced around the room, then leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. You know, I didn't grow up in places like this either. I know how it feels to be the one who doesn't belong." Miguel looked at her, surprised. She didn't look like someone who would know what it was like to struggle, but there was something in her eyes that made him believe her. "Why are you telling me this?" Miguel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can see how they're treating you," Clara said, her voice firm. "And I want you to know that they're wrong. You don't deserve this." Miguel swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He didn't know what to say. No one had ever stood up for him before, not like this. He glanced over at Otavio, who was now watching them, a frown on his face. "Come on," Clara said, nodding toward a quieter corner of the room. "Let's get out of the spotlight for a bit." Miguel followed her, grateful to get away from the stares and the laughter. As they reached the corner, Clara turned to him, her expression serious. "Listen, Miguel," she said. "You don't have to put up with this. You're better than what they think you are." Miguel looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "I need the money," he said, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her eyes softening again. "I understand, but just remember, you're not defined by what they say or how they treat you." Miguel took a deep breath, her words sinking in. For the first time that night, he felt a small spark of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as worthless as Otavio and his friends wanted him to feel. Otavio walked over, his eyes narrowing at Clara. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp. Clara straightened, meeting Otavio's gaze head-on. "Just having a conversation," she said calmly. "Is that a problem?" Otavio's jaw tightened, and he forced a smile. "Not at all," he said, though his eyes told a different story. He turned to Miguel, his voice low. "Come on, kid, let's go." Miguel hesitated, glancing at Clara. She gave him a reassuring nod, and Miguel followed Otavio back into the crowd, his heart pounding. He still felt out of place, still felt the weight of everyone's judgmental stares, but Clara's words stayed with him, giving him the strength to keep going, at least for now. Miguel stood next to Otavio as they moved deeper into the crowd. Otavio kept introducing him, each time adding a new layer of mockery to his words. He called Miguel his special guest from the streets, his project for the night. Each introduction made Miguel feel smaller, and the laughter that followed echoed in his ears. He kept his head down, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "Look at him," Otavio said to a group of men in tailored suits. "I mean, honestly, doesn't he look like he belongs?" The sarcasm in his voice was clear, and the men laughed, their eyes locking on Miguel, as if he were some kind of circus act. Miguel felt his face burn, the shame almost unbearable. He wanted to say something, anything, but he couldn't. His throat was tight, and every word he tried to form seemed to disappear before it reached his lips. He looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of Clara, but she was nowhere in sight. He was alone again. "Come on, Miguel, say something," Otavio taunted, his voice loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Tell them about your life, about what it's like out there on the streets. I'm sure they'd love to hear it." Miguel swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on the floor. The crowd around them grew quiet, waiting for him to speak. He could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their judgment. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the words wouldn't come. All he could think about was how out of place he was, how he didn't belong here, and how everyone in the room knew it. Otavio shook his head, letting out a mocking sigh. "See?" he said to the crowd. "He's got nothing to say. I guess that's what happens when you spend your life begging on the streets." The laughter that followed was like a punch to the gut. Miguel clenched his jaw, his hands trembling. He wanted to leave, to run out of the room and never look back. But then, in the middle of the crowd, he saw her, Clara. She was making her way toward him, her eyes locked on his. "Enough, Otavio," Clara said, her voice firm as she stepped between Miguel and the crowd. She looked at Otavio, her expression hard. "Why are you doing this?" Otavio raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Just having a little fun," he said. "No harm in that, right?" Clara didn't back down. She turned to the crowd, her voice carrying across the room. "This isn't fun. It's cruel," she said, her eyes moving from one person to another. "This boy is a human being, not your entertainment." The room went silent. Miguel looked up, his eyes wide. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Clara was standing up for him, in front of everyone. He had never had anyone do that for him before. Ottavio's smile faltered, and he crossed his arms over his chest. "You're taking this way too seriously, Clara," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "It's just a joke." "It's not a joke to him," Clara shot back. She turned to Miguel, her expression softening. "Come with me," she said. "You don't have to stay here." Miguel hesitated, glancing at Ottavio, then back at Clara. He could see the anger in Ottavio's eyes, the way his jaw clenched. But Clara's eyes were kind, and for the first time that night, Miguel felt like he had a choice. Slowly, Miguel nodded, taking a step toward Clara. Ottavio reached out, grabbing Miguel's arm. "He's not going anywhere," Ottavio said, his voice low, almost a growl. Clara didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on Ottavio's. "Let him go," she said, her voice steady. For a moment, Ottavio hesitated, his grip tightening on Miguel's arm. Then, slowly, he let go, his hand dropping to his side. He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Fine," he said, his tone cold. "If he wants to go, let him go." Miguel stepped back, his arm still tingling where Ottavio had grabbed him. He followed Clara through the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was still quiet, the guests watching as they walked away. Miguel could feel their eyes on him, but for once, he didn't care. He was done being their entertainment. Clara led him to a quieter corner of the room, away from the crowd. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Miguel nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Clara smiled, a soft, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "No one deserves to be treated like that." Miguel looked down, his hands still trembling. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened that night, the humiliation, the shame, the fear. But Clara's words, her kindness, made it a little easier to bear. "I don't belong here," Miguel said, his voice cracking. Clara shook her head. "Neither do most of them," she said. "But that doesn't matter. You have as much right to be here as anyone else." Miguel looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. He wanted to believe her, but it was hard. He had spent his whole life being told he was nothing, that he didn't belong. But there was something in Clara's eyes, something that made him think maybe, just maybe, she was right. Ottavio's voice suddenly cut through the room, loud and mocking. "Look at them," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The hero and the street rat. How touching." Miguel felt his heart sink. He turned to see Ottavio standing there, a sneer on his face. His friends gathered around him, all of them laughing. Miguel's hands clenched into fists, his face burning with anger and embarrassment. Clara stepped forward, her chin held high. "You don't get to do this, Ottavio," she said, her voice steady. "Not tonight." Ottavio's smile faded, and for a moment, there was a tense silence. Then, slowly, he shrugged, turning away with a dismissive wave. "Whatever," he muttered. "I'm done here." Miguel watched as Ottavio walked away, his friends following. He felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, his body sagging as the tension left him. Clara turned to him, her eyes softening. "You did good," she said. "You stood your ground." Miguel shook his head. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You stayed," Clara said. "That's something." Miguel looked at her, and for the first time that night, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as worthless as he had always thought. Maybe there was a way out of this life, a way to be more than just a kid from the streets. Clara smiled, a gentle, encouraging smile. "Come on," she said. "Let's get out of here." Miguel nodded, following her out of the room. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe there was a chance for something better. Miguel followed Clara through the dimly lit hallway leading away from the grand ballroom. The heavy noise of the crowd slowly faded behind them, replaced by the quiet shuffle of their footsteps. Miguel felt the tension in his shoulders slowly begin to loosen. But before they could reach the exit, they heard Ottavio's voice calling after them. "Where do you think you're going?" Ottavio said, his tone cold and mocking. Clara turned around, and Miguel looked over his shoulder to see Ottavio approaching, his expression hard. Clara stepped forward, putting herself between Ottavio and Miguel. "We're leaving," she said firmly. "This isn't his place, and you know it." Ottavio ignored her, his eyes fixed on Miguel. He took a step closer, his presence looming. "You think you're better than us now?" he asked, his voice low. "You think because she stood up for you, you belong here?" Miguel kept his eyes down, his hands clenching at his sides. He didn't want to answer. He wanted to leave, to be done with this night. But Otavio wasn't finished. "Tell me, Miguel," Otavio continued, his voice growing louder. "How much did she promise you, huh? How much is she paying you to make you think you deserve to be here?" Miguel looked up, his face flushed with anger. He opened his mouth to respond, but Clara spoke first, her voice cutting through the tension. "Stop it, Otavio," she said, her tone sharp. "This has gone far enough." Otavio turned his glare toward Clara, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, it's gone far enough," he said, a sneer twisting his lips. "Not until I hear him admit it. Come on, Miguel. Tell everyone how you're just here for the money." Miguel felt his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the remaining guests on him, waiting, watching. He wanted to run, to get away from all of it, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He looked at Clara, saw the concern in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't keep running. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet at first. "I took the money. I needed it." He looked directly at Otavio, his eyes steady now. "But that doesn't mean I'm any less of a person than you." The room fell silent, Otavio's smirk faltering for just a moment before he regained his composure. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're really something, kid. You think you can stand here and lecture me?" He reached behind him, grabbing a microphone from a nearby stand. He shoved it toward Miguel, his eyes challenging. "Prove it. Prove you belong here." Miguel stared at the microphone, his pulse racing. He could hear the whispers around him, the eyes on him. He knew this was Otavio's final move, a way to humiliate him once and for all. But then he thought about what Clara had said, about not letting people like Otavio define him. He thought about the life he wanted, one that was different from the one he had on the streets. Slowly, Miguel reached out, taking the microphone from Otavio's hand. He felt his throat tighten, his stomach in knots, but he held on. He glanced at Clara, and she gave him a small nod, her eyes filled with encouragement. The room was still, the air heavy with anticipation. Miguel lifted the microphone to his lips, his voice shaky as he began. "I know I don't look like I belong here," he said, his voice echoing through the speakers. He paused, taking a deep breath. "I know most of you think I'm just some kid from the streets, and you're right, I am." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the guests who were still watching. Some looked amused, others curious, but a few, just a few, looked almost empathetic. "But that doesn't mean I don't have a story. It doesn't mean I don't have dreams or hopes. Just because I grew up without money, without a home, doesn't mean I'm not worth something." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, the words coming more easily now. "You look at me and see someone who's less than you, but I see someone who's survived, someone who's still here, even after everything." He paused, his eyes finding Otavio's. The man's face was blank, his smirk gone. "You wanted me to be your entertainment," Miguel said, his voice steady. "But I'm not here for that. I'm here because I want more. I want a chance at something better." The room was silent, no laughter, no whispers. Miguel could feel the tension in the air, but he didn't care anymore. He had said what he needed to say. He looked at Clara, who was smiling, her eyes filled with pride. Miguel took a deep breath and lowered the microphone, handing it back to Otavio. Otavio took it, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at Miguel, then at Clara, before turning away, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Clara stepped forward, her hand resting on Miguel's shoulder. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's go." Miguel nodded, his body shaking from the adrenaline. As they walked away, he could feel the eyes of the guests on him, but this time he didn't feel ashamed. He felt proud. He had stood up for himself, even when everything inside him told him to run. They reached the exit, and Clara paused, looking at Miguel. "You did great," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "You really did." Miguel looked down, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks," he said. "For everything." Clara nodded, her eyes softening. "This isn't the end, you know. You have so much ahead of you." Miguel took a deep breath, the weight of the night finally starting to lift. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. They stepped out into the cool night air, the door closing behind them. Miguel looked up at the stars, his heart still pounding but filled with hope. He had faced Otavio, faced his fears, and he was still standing. Clara smiled at him, and Miguel nodded. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. And together, they walked away from the past, toward whatever came next. The cool night air didn't linger for long. Clara led Miguel to a bench in a small courtyard just outside the ballroom. The quiet was a stark contrast to the loud and chaotic event they'd just left. Miguel sat down, his head spinning, the weight of what had just happened still fresh on his shoulders. Clara sat beside him, her presence calm and reassuring. "Take a minute," Clara said, her voice gentle. "It's been a long night." Miguel nodded, staring down at his hands. They were still trembling, his fingers cold against his palms. He could hear the sounds of the city in the distance, cars passing, people laughing, the hum of life continuing without them. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the sounds ground him. After a while, Clara spoke again, her voice soft. "You know, what you said in there, it was brave. Not everyone can do that, especially in front of a crowd like that." Miguel opened his eyes, glancing at her. There was no mockery in her face, no pity, just sincerity. He let out a small sigh, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't feel brave," he admitted. "I felt like I was gonna pass out." Clara chuckled lightly, nodding. "That's usually how it feels, but you did it anyway. That's what matters." Miguel looked down again, a small, unsure smile on his lips. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that what he had done mattered, that he was more than just a kid from the streets, but the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. "I've never had anyone stand up for me before," Miguel said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I don't know why you did." Clara's expression softened. She leaned back, her gaze drifting up to the stars above them. "Because I know what it's like," she said. "I grew up in a place like yours, different streets, but the same struggles. And I know how it feels to think that no one will ever see you as anything more than where you came from." Miguel looked at her, surprise crossing his face. She didn't look like someone who'd struggled. Her clothes, her confidence, everything about her seemed to scream success. But as she spoke, he could hear the honesty in her words. "How did you get out?" he asked. Clara smiled, a wistful look in her eyes. "A lot of luck, and a lot of people who were willing to give me a chance," she said. "But I had to work for it, every step of the way, and I made a promise to myself that if I ever made it, I'd do the same for others." Miguel was quiet for a moment, her words settling in. He wanted that, a chance, a way out. But the fear of failing, of not being enough, held him back. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do you really think I could change things? Make something of myself?" Clara turned to him, her gaze steady. "I know you can. It won't be easy. It'll take time, and a lot of work. But you're stronger than you think, Miguel. You've survived things most people wouldn't even know how to handle." Miguel swallowed hard, her words hitting him in a way he wasn't used to. He had spent so long being told he was nothing, being looked at like he was less. To hear someone say he could be more, it was almost too much to believe. Clara stood up, extending her hand to him. "Come on," she said. "Let's get out of here. I have a place you can stay for the night. It's not much, but it's warm, and you won't have to worry about anything." Miguel hesitated, looking up at her. He had never trusted anyone enough to accept this kind of help. But Clara, something about her made him want to believe. Slowly, he took her hand, letting her pull him to his feet. They walked away from the courtyard, the lights of the ballroom fading behind them. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into the night. They didn't talk much, just walked side by side, the silence between them comfortable. Miguel felt the tension in his body slowly begin to ease, the fear that had gripped him all night starting to fade. They reached a small building, tucked away on a side street. Clara led him inside, up a narrow staircase to a small room. It was simple, a bed, a chair, a small table. But to Miguel, it looked like a palace. He hadn't slept in a bed in months, maybe longer. Clara smiled, gesturing to the bed. "It's yours for the night. Get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." Miguel nodded, his eyes still wide as he took in the room. He turned to Clara, his voice quiet. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Clara shook her head, her smile gentle. "You don't have to. Just promise me one thing." Miguel looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What's that?" "Don't give up on yourself," Clara said, her eyes holding his. "You're worth more than you think." Miguel felt his throat tighten, the emotions of the night catching up to him. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll try." Clara smiled, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "That's all I ask. Good night, Miguel." With that, she turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind her. Miguel stood there for a moment, the quiet of the room settling around him. He took a deep breath, his eyes drifting to the bed. Slowly, he walked over, sitting down on the edge of the mattress. It was soft, the blankets warm beneath his hands. He lay back, staring up at the ceiling, his mind still racing. He thought about everything that had happened. Otavio's mocking smile, the laughter of the crowd, Clara's kind eyes. He had faced it all, and he was still here. He had spoken, had stood up for himself, even when he thought he couldn't. For the first time in a long time, Miguel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things could be different. Maybe there was a way out, a way to be more than just a kid from the streets. He closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion of the night wash over him. As he drifted off to sleep, Clara's words echoed in his mind. "Don't give up on yourself." He held on to those words, letting them comfort him as he slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first rays of morning sunlight peeked through the curtain, waking Miguel. He blinked, slowly adjusting to his surrounding. The bed was soft, and for a moment, he forgot where he was. Then, the events of the previous night came rushing back. The gala, Otavio's humiliation, Clara's kindness. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, the reality settling in. He got up and walked to the window, peering outside. The street below was quiet, a few people walking by, unaware of the change that had begun in his life. Miguel sighed, turning around just as he heard a knock on the door. "Come in," he called out, his voice still groggy. The door opened, and Clara stepped inside, a gentle smile on her face. She was carrying a bag, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the room. "Good morning," she said, setting the bag down on the small table. "I brought breakfast. Figured you'd be hungry." Miguel's stomach growled at the mention of food, and he smiled sheepishly. "Yeah, thanks," he said, moving to sit at the table. Clara took a seat across from him, watching as Miguel dug into the bread. They sat in silence for a moment, the room filled with the simple sounds of breakfast, crinkling paper, the crunch of bread. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice soft. "I was thinking," she began, "if you want, I can help you find something more stable. A job, maybe even a place to stay." Miguel paused, looking up at her. He didn't know what to say. The idea of stability, of having a real shot at something better, seemed almost impossible. But here she was, offering him exactly that. "Why?" Miguel asked, his voice hesitant. "Why are you helping me?" Clara smiled, her eyes kind. "Because I believe in you. I know what it's like to feel like you have nothing, like no one sees you. But I see you, Miguel, and I know you're capable of more than just surviving." Miguel swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "Okay, I want to try." Clara smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Good. We'll start with something small. There's a friend of mine who runs a small shop. He could use some help, just a few hours a day to start. It's not much, but it's a start." Miguel nodded again, a sense of determination building within him. "I'll do it," he said. "I want to do it." Clara reached across the table, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm proud of you, Miguel. This isn't going to be easy, but I'll be here to help you, every step of the way." Miguel took a deep breath, her words giving him strength. For the first time, he felt like maybe there was a way out, a way to make something of himself. He wanted to prove to Clara, to himself, that he was more than just a kid from the streets. Later that day, Clara took Miguel to the shop she had mentioned. It was a small place, a modest store with shelves lined with various goods. The owner, a kind-looking man named Luis, greeted them warmly. Clara introduced Miguel, explaining the situation briefly. Luis nodded, extending his hand to Miguel. "Any friend of Clara's is a friend of mine," Luis said, smiling. "I could use the help, and you look like you're ready to work." Miguel shook his hand, a sense of relief washing over him. This was real, an opportunity, a way forward. Clara gave him an encouraging nod, and Miguel spent the next few hours learning the basic. Luis was patient, showing him how to stock shelves, how to work the register. Miguel made mistakes, fumbled with the items, but Luis never raised his voice, never made him feel small. As the day went on, Miguel found himself settling into the rhythm of the work. It was simple, repetitive, but it was work, honest work. And at the end of the day, Luis clapped him on the back, a smile on his face. "Good job, Miguel," he said. "I think you're going to fit in just fine here." Miguel smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Luis," he said, the gratitude evident in his voice. Clara arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, her smile growing when she saw Miguel behind the counter. She waited as Miguel finished up, then walked over to him. "How was it?" she asked. Miguel shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "It was good. Hard, but good." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with pride. "I knew you could do it." They walked back to the small room where Miguel had stayed the previous night. The streets were quieter now, the city bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun. Clara spoke as they walked, her voice calm and reassuring. "You've taken the first step, Miguel. It's not going to be easy, but you're on your way, and I'll be here no matter what." Miguel glanced at her, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions, gratitude, hope, fear. He nodded, his voice soft. "Thank you, for everything." Clara smiled, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to thank me. Just keep moving forward. That's all I ask." Miguel took a deep breath, the weight of the day slowly lifting. He had faced his fears, had taken a step toward something better, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could make something of himself. They reached the room, and Clara paused at the door, turning to face him. "You've got a long road ahead, Miguel, but you're not alone. And you're stronger than you think." Miguel nodded, a small smile on his lips. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. Clara smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I know you are. Get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." Miguel watched as she left, the door closing softly behind her. He turned, looking around the small room. It wasn't much, but it was his for now. A place to rest, a place to start again. He sat down on the bed, his body aching from the day's work. But it was a good ache, a reminder that he was moving forward. He lay back, closing his eyes, Clara's words echoing in his mind. "You're stronger than you think." Miguel held on to those words, letting them comfort him as he drifted off to sleep, ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Miguel awoke with the early light filtering in through the curtain. He blinked at the ceiling, taking a moment to remember where he was. It wasn't the damp alley or the cold pavement. It was a small room, warm and safe. He sat up, stretching out his sore limbs, feeling the ache from yesterday's work. A small smile tugged at his lips. He hadn't felt this kind of tired in a long time, and he liked it. It was the kind of tired that came from doing something meaningful. A gentle knock at the door made him turn his head. "Come in," Miguel called out, and the door opened to reveal Clara, her smile as warm as the morning sun. "Morning, Miguel," she said, stepping into the room. She carried a small bag, which she set down on the table. "Brought you some breakfast again. Thought you might need it." Miguel's stomach growled in response, and he grinned, embarrassed. "Thanks, Clara," he said, moving to sit at the table. She watched as he dug into the bread and fruit, her eyes filled with a quiet pride. After a few minutes, she spoke, her voice thoughtful. "You know, I was thinking, if you're up for it, there's more I can help you with. You've already taken the first step, getting the job. But if you're really serious about this, I can help you find a more permanent place to stay. Maybe even help you get some classes under your belt." Miguel paused, looking up at her. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities. A permanent place to stay. Classes. He hadn't even thought that far ahead. Just the idea of not sleeping on the streets was enough to overwhelm him, let alone school or training. I don't know," Miguel said, his voice hesitant. It's a lot." Clara nodded, her eyes understanding. "I get it, Miguel. It's a lot to take in, but I believe in you, and if you want it, really want it, I'm here to help you get there. No pressure, though. It's your choice." Miguel looked down at his half-eaten bread, her words sinking in. A real place to call his own, a chance to learn, to build a future. It all seemed too good to be true. But then he thought about how far he'd already come, the courage it had taken to step into that ballroom, to speak up, to take the job. Maybe this was just the next step. He swallowed hard, looking up at Clara. I think I want to try," he said, his voice shaky but determined. Clara smiled, her eyes lighting up. "That's all I need to hear," she said. She reached across the table, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "One step at a time, all right? Today, we'll focus on your work at Luis' shop, and then we can start figuring out the rest." Miguel nodded, a small smile on his face. One step at a time, that he could do. Later that morning, Clara walked him back to Luis's shop. The sun was bright, the air crisp, and for the first time in a long time, Miguel felt something like hope blossoming in his chest. He glanced at Clara as they walked, her calm presence giving him the strength he needed. When they arrived at the shop, Luis greeted them with a warm smile. "Morning, Miguel," he said. "Ready for another day?" Miguel nodded, determination in his eyes. "Yeah, I'm ready." Luis clapped him on the shoulder, guiding him to the back where they began organizing boxes and stocking shelves. The work was simple, but it was something Miguel could do well. He focused on each task, taking pride in every shelf he stocked, every box he unpacked. Luis showed him the ropes, always patient, always willing to explain things twice if needed. As the day went on, Miguel started to feel more comfortable. He even began chatting a bit with the other workers. Small things, like asking where something went or how to restock a certain shelf. They didn't treat him like he was different, like he was lesser, and that made all the difference. He felt like he was part of something, a small piece in a bigger puzzle. During his lunch break, Miguel stepped outside to get some fresh air. He leaned against the wall, looking out at the bustling street. For once, he wasn't out there, cleaning windshields or begging for change. He was on the other side, looking in. It felt strange, but it also felt good. Clara arrived a little after sunset, just like the day before. She waited while Miguel wrapped up his task, chatting with Luis and the other workers. When Miguel was done, Luis gave him a pat on the back, his eyes warm. "You did good today, kid," Luis said. "Keep it up, and there might be more work for you down the line." Miguel smiled, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thanks, Luis. I really appreciate it." Clara smiled at Miguel as they left the shop, the evening air cool around them. They walked in silence for a while, the streetlights flickering to life as the sun dipped below the horizon. Miguel felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, one that came from honest work. As they neared the building where Miguel was staying, Clara finally spoke, her voice soft. "You did well today, Miguel. Luis likes you. And that's not something he says lightly." Miguel smiled, looking down at his feet. "It feels good, you know, to be doing something real, to not just be surviving." Clara nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "That's what this is all about, Miguel. Not just surviving, but living, building something for yourself." Miguel looked up at her, his expression serious. "I want that. I want to build something. I don't want to go back to the streets." Clara smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You won't. Not if you keep going like this. One step at a time. Remember?" Miguel nodded, taking a deep breath. One step at a time. That was all he needed to focus on. And with Clara by his side, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could do it. They reached the building, and Clara paused at the entrance, turning to face Miguel. "Get some rest, all right? Tomorrow's another day, and we've got more steps to take." Miguel smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Thanks, Clara, for everything." She gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder. "You're doing all the work, Miguel. I'm just here to help." Miguel watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the night. He turned and headed inside, climbing the narrow stairs to his room. It was small, but it was his, and that was enough for now. He lay down on the bed, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He stared up at the ceiling, his thoughts drifting to the future. He didn't know what was coming, didn't know if he'd be able to make it. But for the first time, he felt like he had a shot, and that was more than he'd ever had before. Miguel closed his eyes, letting the quiet of the room settle around him. One step at a time, he thought, holding on to Clara's words. One step at a time. And with that, he drifted off to sleep, ready to face whatever came next. The morning came quicker than Miguel had expected. The sunlight crept through the curtain, and he blinked awake, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Today felt different. It was another day at the shop, another day to prove himself, but it was also the beginning of something more. A new routine, a new reality. He got up, washed his face in the small sink, and tried to tidy up his hair. It wasn't much, but he wanted to look presentable. Clara had told him that how he showed up mattered, and Miguel took that to heart. A knock sounded at the door, and he knew it was Clara. He opened it to find her smiling at him, a small paper bag in her hand. "Morning, Miguel," she said cheerfully. "Ready for another day?" Miguel nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, ready as I'll ever be." Clara handed him the bag. "Breakfast again. Gotta keep your strength up if you're going to impress Luis today." Miguel took the bag, smiling. "Thanks, Clara," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. They headed out together, walking the now familiar streets to Luis' shop. As they walked, Miguel felt his nerves settling. Clara's presence was reassuring, like a steady hand guiding him through unfamiliar waters. He could feel her belief in him, and it made all the difference. When they reached the shop, Clara gave him a pat on the back. "You've got this, Miguel. Just keep doing what you've been doing." Miguel nodded, taking a deep breath. He turned and stepped into the shop, the bell above the door ringing softly. Luis looked up from behind the counter, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Morning, Miguel," Luis called. "Right on time. That's what I like to see." Miguel smiled back, walking over to where Luis was organizing some paperwork. "Morning, Luis. What do you need me to start with today?" Luis nodded approvingly, waving him over to a stack of boxes in the back. "We've got a new delivery today. Need these stocked and sorted, then we'll work on some organizing out front." Miguel rolled up his sleeves, setting to work immediately. He took his time, making sure everything went where it belonged. Each box he opened, each item he placed, was a small victory, a reminder that he was making progress. It wasn't much, but it was work. Real, honest work. And that mattered. The hours passed quickly as Miguel focused on his task. He made a few mistakes, of course, putting some items in the wrong places, or forgetting a label here and there. But Luis never raised his voice, never scolded him. He just showed Miguel what he needed to do, then let him fix it himself. It was different from anything Miguel had ever experienced. It made him want to do better. Around midday, Luis called for a break. He handed Miguel a sandwich and a bottle of water, his eyes filled with kindness. "Haha, you're doing well, kid. I can tell you want to be here." Miguel took the sandwich, his throat tightening at Luis' words. He nodded, his voice thick. "I do. I really do." Luis smiled, giving Miguel a pat on the back. "Good. That's all that matters. Keep working like this, and you're going to do just fine." Miguel felt a swell of emotion, gratitude, pride, hope, all tangled together. He had spent so long feeling like he was nothing, like no one believed in him. Now, he had Clara, he had Luis, and most importantly, he was starting to believe in himself. After lunch, Miguel continued stocking shelves, his confidence growing with each task. The other workers began chatting with him more, treating him like he was one of them. It was small things, jokes about the weather, complaints about the work, but it meant the world to Miguel. He was part of something now, something bigger than just himself. Later in the afternoon, a woman came into the shop with her young daughter. The little girl looked around, her eyes wide as she took in all the colorful items. Miguel watched her, a smile tugging at his lips as she tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing to a shelf filled with bright toys. The mother smiled at Miguel, her eyes kind. "Could you help us find something for her birthday?" she asked. Miguel nodded, stepping over to the shelf. "Sure," he said, crouching down so he was eye level with the little girl. "What's your name?" The girl giggled, hiding behind her mother's leg. "Anna," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Miguel smiled, picking up one of the toys, a bright red car with flashing lights. "How about this one, Anna? It's pretty cool." The girl peeked out, her eyes widening. She nodded, her face lighting up with excitement. Miguel handed her the toy, her giggle filling the shop. The mother thanked Miguel, her eyes softening. "You're very kind," she said, her voice sincere. Miguel stood up, his face flushing slightly. "Just doing my job," he said. But inside, he felt something warm spread through his chest. It was a simple moment, but it was enough to make him realize that maybe he could make a difference, even in small ways. As the day came to an end, Luis gathered the workers around the counter. He handed each of them a small envelope, their pay for the day. When he handed one to Miguel, Miguel hesitated, his eyes widening. He hadn't expected this, not so soon. "Take it," Luis said, his smile kind. "It's Aggie. You've earned it." Miguel took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Luis, his throat tight. "Thank you," he whispered. Luis patted his shoulder. "No need to thank me, kid. You did the work. You earned it." Miguel nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He slipped the envelope into his pocket, a sense of pride settling deep inside him. This was the first time he had earned money, real money, through hard work. It was his, and it felt like a first step towards something better. When Clara arrived to pick him up, Miguel was standing at the counter, saying his goodbyes to Luis and the other workers. She smiled when she saw him, her eyes shining with pride. "How was it today?" she asked as they walked out of the shop, the evening air cool around them. Miguel looked at her, a smile spreading across his face. "It was good," he said. "Really good." "I got paid today?" Clara's eyes lit up, her smile widening. "That's amazing, Miguel. I knew you could do it." Miguel nodded, his heart pounding with excitement and hope. "It feels different, you know, like I'm actually doing something that matters." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "That's because you are, Miguel. You're building something for yourself, one step at a time, and I couldn't be prouder of you." Miguel looked down, his eyes stinging. He took a deep breath, his voice quiet. "I want to keep going, Clara. I want to see where this can take me." Clara smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "And you will, Miguel. This is just the beginning. There's so much ahead of you." They walked in silence for a while, the city settling into the night around them. Miguel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. He had a job, a place to sleep, people who believed in him, and for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could build something more. When they reached the building, Clara paused, turning to face him. "Get some rest, all right? Tomorrow's another day, and we've got more steps to take." Miguel nodded, his heart filled with determination. "I will." "Thanks, Clara," she smiled, giving him a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Good night, Miguel." Miguel watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the darkness. He turned and headed inside, climbing the stairs to his room. He lay down on the bed, exhaustion settling in. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small envelope Luis had given him. He opened it, staring at the few bills inside. It wasn't much, but it was his. He closed his eyes, a smile on his lips. One step at a time, he thought, holding on to Clara's words. One step at a time. And with that, he drifted off to sleep, ready to face whatever came next. The morning sunlight came pouring through the curtain, filling the small room with warmth. Miguel blinked awake, the realization of where he was settling over him like a comforting blanket. He sat up, stretching his sore limbs, a small smile tugging at his lips. It was the beginning of a new day, and he was ready for it. After getting dressed, Miguel made his way downstairs, where Clara was already waiting with a warm smile and a bag of breakfast in her hand. She handed it to him, her eyes shining with pride. "Morning, Miguel. Got another big day ahead of us." Miguel took the bag, his stomach already growling. "Thanks, Clara," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I'm ready." Today was different, though. Clara had hinted the night before that she had something planned, something important. Miguel was curious but didn't press for details. He trusted her. As they made their way to Luis's shop, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. When they arrived, Luis was standing at the door, waiting for them. He smiled broadly at Miguel, his eyes full of warmth. "Morning, kid," he said. "Got something special for you today." Miguel's brow furrowed in confusion. "Special?" he asked, glancing at Clara, who was smiling knowingly. Luis gestured for them to follow him inside. He led Miguel to the back of the shop, where a small group of people were waiting. Other workers, customers he had helped over the past few days, and even a couple of people from the neighborhood. Miguel's eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's all this?" Miguel asked, his voice shaky. Luis placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder, his smile softening. "This is for you, Miguel. These people wanted to thank you. You've made a difference here, and they wanted you to know it." Miguel's throat tightened, emotion welling up inside him. He looked at the faces around him, smiling, kind, welcoming. The little girl, Anna, who he had helped pick a toy for, was there with her mother. The mother stepped forward, her eyes warm. "You helped make my daughter's birthday special," she said, her voice gentle. "We wanted to thank you for that." Miguel felt tears prick at his eyes, his chest swelling with emotion. He had never been thanked like this before, never felt like he mattered to anyone. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to say." Clara stepped forward, her hand resting gently on his back. "You don't have to say anything, Miguel. Just know that you've made an impact here. You belong." Miguel looked around the room, his eyes meeting the gaze of each person there. They were all smiling, their eyes filled with warmth and acceptance. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. This was what it felt like to be part of something, to be seen. Luis patted him on the back. "All right, enough of the mushy stuff," he said, grinning. "We've got work to do, kid. But just remember, this is just the beginning. You keep working like this, and there's no telling where you'll go." Miguel nodded, his eyes still glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "All of you. This means more to me than I can say." The rest of the day passed quickly, the energy from the morning's surprise giving Miguel a new sense of purpose. He worked harder than ever, stocking shelves, helping customers, making sure everything was in its place. He felt different, more confident, more capable. He was no longer just surviving. He was building something for himself. By the time the day ended, Miguel was exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion, one that came from knowing he had done something meaningful. Clara arrived to pick him up, her smile as bright as ever. "You were amazing today, Miguel," she said as they walked back to his room. "Way, I'm so proud of you." Miguel smiled, looking down at his feet. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Clara," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You believed in me when no one else did." Clara shook her head, her eyes softening. "You did all the work, Miguel. I just gave you a push. You're stronger than you know." They reached the building and Clara paused at the entrance, turning to face him. I've been thinking, Miguel. I know this room has been good for you, but I want you to have something more permanent, a place of your own." Miguel's eyes widened, his heart skipping a beat. "A place of my own," he echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. Clara nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, I've been talking to Luis, and there's a small apartment not far from the shop. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it. A real home, Miguel, somewhere you can feel safe." Miguel felt tears welling up in his eyes, his throat tightening. He had never had a home, not since he lost his mother. The idea of having a place of his own, somewhere he could truly belong, was almost too much to believe. I don't know what to say," Miguel whispered, his voice cracking. Clara reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Say yes, Miguel. You've worked so hard, and you deserve this. You deserve a chance at a real life." Miguel swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with tears. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I want it." Clara smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Good. Then it's settled. We'll get you moved in tomorrow." Miguel felt a swell of emotion, a mixture of gratitude, hope, and something he hadn't felt in a long time. Happiness. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Clara, for everything." She pulled him into a hug, her voice soft. "You've earned this, Miguel, and this is just the beginning. There's so much ahead of you." Miguel hugged her back, his heart filled with hope. For the first time, he felt like he had a future, something more than just surviving, something real, something worth fighting for. When they pulled away, Clara gave him a gentle pat on the back. "Get some rest tonight, Miguel. Tomorrow, we start the next chapter." Miguel nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I will. I'm ready." Clara smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "I know you are." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Miguel watched her go, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. He turned and headed inside, climbing the stairs to his room for what he knew would be one of the last times. He lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind filled with thoughts of the future. A home of his own, a job, people who believed in him. It was all more than he had ever dreamed of, and it was real. One step at a time, Miguel thought, holding on to Clara's words. One step at a time. And with that, he closed his eyes, ready to face whatever came next. This was just the beginning of his new life, and he was ready for every moment of it.